Today I went to Old Newgate Prison in East Granby, Connecticut, named after Newgate Prison in England because Puritans were super boring, and also weird because it's newer than Newgate, but that's besides the point. This was actually started as a copper mine in 1707 by 3 clergymen who were shown where to mine by indigenous people. But because of British law at the time, smelting was prohibited in America. So they had to ship the entire ore mass back to England to be extracted. And there was pretty large shipping costs. So it failed within 4 years. It was later bought, or it was actually leased from the town after this man had taken out a loan for £10,000. And this time, to save costs, they used both African and indigenous slaves. But it never really was very lucrative. So in 1773, it was bought by the state to become a prison. And the first prisoner there was a man named John Hinson, who was sentenced to 10 years for burglary. And he was pretty much a career criminal. After a whole 18 days in the prison, he escaped. And from 1773 to 1776, almost all the prisoners they had escaped. So they had a great track record. In the spring of 1776, a bunch of prisoners started smuggling hay down into the mine to use as kindling to burn a wooden door which had been over the exit shaft. But because it was so damp down there that it only smoldered, and the smoke was bad enough to kill one of the prisoners. And then in 1782, the wooden buildings were destroyed by fire, which allowed another big escape of inmates. And in the early 1800s, it became a popular site for tourists, and many of the written accounts just talk about how bad it smelled. In 1827, the prison finally closed. They made mining attempts through the 1830s and 50s. And then in 1968, it was acquired by the State Historic Commission. There is peacock ore and malachite here. Apparently they did not know they had peacock ore, but now they do. These steps were put in by the state. The beams are interesting. This one is actually original. It's chestnut before we had the chestnut blight. And then the beams that were put in the 1800s are actually telephone poles. So they reused them, put them in here. This is looking up from the bottom of the well that comes up outside. This is actually a solitary confinement cell, and the arrow is pointing to where they would chain prisoners. There would have been no light down here, and this part actually floods. And there was, of course, no bathroom. They were fed water and bread every 12 hours by a guard who was not allowed to talk to them. And they'd be there, I believe he said, for 7 weeks at a time. This site is where some prisoners, 2 of them, had attempted to dig a tunnel up to escape. But while they were digging, it collapsed. And their bodies were actually never recovered. So they are still there. The mine is 52 degrees year-round also, and there is a fairly large colony of bats down here as well. And this is where the water table begins. So our tour guide Bob is pointing. This is where some air shafts were dug, one vertical, one horizontal, because at one point the conditions back there were just horrible. The prisoners were actually housed in the cave, or excuse me, the mine when it first opened, in bunks with no lights. They were just chained up with no supervision, and there were prisoners as young as 14 years old down there, housed with everyone else. There was no segregation, so you'd have a 14-year-old there for, I mean, probably something stupid, because, you know, what's a 14-year-old doing in the 1700s? And they could have been there with murderers. So it just became complete bedlam once the guards locked them down there for the night. Overall, pretty horrible. It's not a wonder that people escaped. You can go visit today. Go visit my friend Bob, the tour guide. He was amazing. So if you're in the area, definitely stop by and take a look for yourself.